Hello everyone, and welcome back to another edition of The Feeding Frenzy. I'm your host, Eric Wenzel, as always. The Feeding Frenzy is my take at a little signal above the noise each week for you to enjoy. And with that, we're going to jump right into the podcast worth listening this week. The podcast I have this week for you is Paul Conti on The Tim Ferriss Show. Dr. Paul Conti is a graduate of Stanford University School of Medicine. He completed his psychiatry training at Stanford and Harvard. He was appointed chief resident and then served on the medical faculty before moving to Portland and founding a clinic. I heavily resonated with Paul's work and mainly works well in a podcast with how he articulates. I find his voice to be really soothing and simple to understand. Much of this podcast centers around Dr. Conti's new book, Trauma, which is now on my ever-expanding to-read list after listening to the podcast. First, to preface the word trauma, most of us assume trauma to be life-changing events, but trauma can occur in small ways too. I tend to think of trauma as big T or little t, and they can both have massive impacts on how we view our well-being. And then one idea from this podcast I found interesting is selective abstraction, which is a type of cognitive bias or cognitive distortion in which a detail is taken out of context and believed. In contrast, everything else in this context is ignored. Part of Dr. Conti's work is about helping change the stories we tell ourselves about our experiences, especially with a negative valence. Wherever you land on the spectrum of trauma, there is a great benefit to the quality of your life to heal those wounds as much as you can. Worth reading this week, I have an excerpt from another book. It is Of Two Minds, How Fast and Slow Thinking Shape Perception and Choice. This was from the Scientific American. I think this fits quite nicely with Dr. Conti's podcast as it outlines two phenomenon in thinking. And mostly too, the way that society seems to be ramping up as of late is thinking very fast about complex things. I think that we need to pause and pump the brakes in some respects and actually think about it. And to elaborate, System 1 thinking operates automatically, quickly, with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. System 2 allocates attention to effortful mental activities that demand it, including complex computations. Thus, the operations of System 2 are often associated with subjective experience of agency, choice, and concentration. This article goes into detail of different activities that require System 1 and System 2 thinking. If you're like me, my mind begins to wonder what tasks I should move from System 1 to System 2. In most cases, more than we think, especially if you want to make a meaningful change in your life. The authors posit that trying to do everything with System 2 thinking is impractical and at the very least tedious. The point is that understanding we all have a blind spot in seeing our own mistakes, but if we create habits that catch those errors when the stakes are high, we can improve. And as always, this is a much larger book. This was only a tiny excerpt that I even summarized here, but I think this book, it should be at the top of most people's reading list if you want to learn how to think better for yourself and attempt to fill in your blind spot. For worth watching, how a handful of powder contaminated a whole city, or the Goiânia incident with Kyle Hill. This strategy is one of fatal attraction, or referencing the System 1 thinking. It's very much the limitations of our own biology. The Goiânia incident was an accident in Brazil. The container had a powder that would glow blue. This powder is cesium-137, heavily radioactive. It was due to the attractive blue glow. If we weren't such social creatures to share interesting objects, we would not have had this accident. After the radioactive material was contained, over 1,000 people were exposed, 249 of them were seriously contaminated, and 20 had acute radiation sickness. Even in the aftermath, people rioted about the burial of those who were brought back into the city after they had passed away. From the International Atomic Agency, it is relevant to note that interest aroused by the blue glow that emanated from the radioactive cesium chloride significantly affected the course of the accident. I find the nuclear accidents of this nature as warnings and ways to boost the knowledge for those that might otherwise be aware of these elements. The fatal attraction that allowed exposure to spread is known as a biological trap. At no point in human history would a glowing material be so deadly. The power and danger of radiation is that we as humans have figured out ways to harness it. But at the same time, our biology has no tools to let us know that we've been exposed until it's too late and we have visible symptoms. So this is, again, another way of arming yourself with knowledge in a way to see past limitations that may otherwise seem minor. And to close this week's episode with a quote. This quote is from David Brooks from his book, which I'm reading right now, The Road to Character. Recovering from suffering is not like recovering from a disease. Many people don't come out healed. They come out different. And that is going to end today's Feeding Frenzy. And I hope you all took something away from this. And if you found any of this interesting or have anything else you'd like to share with me that may end up in a future edition of the Feeding Frenzy, please leave a comment or connect with me on any other social media. And with that, everyone, thank you all for joining today and listening. And I will see you all in the next edition.